For more on the Ukraine crisis, I'm joined by geopolitical analyst Eugene Chausovsky from here in Washington. Thanks very much for joining us there, Eugene. Now, despite US and NATO troops arriving in the region, Russian troops show no sign of backing down. In fact, US officials have said that Russia has 70% of its combat needed for a full-scale invasion. Is there any chance of diplomacy at this point?
Well, I think we are still at the stage of diplomacy because, as you mentioned, Russia continues to build up its military forces along the Ukrainian border, as well as U.S. NATO forces in some surrounding countries. But there's still some meetings that are scheduled to be held in the coming week or two, both with European countries, between the U.S. and Russia. So Russia is certainly signaling militarily, but it is also leaving the diplomatic window open.
But how far would Russia be willing to go if once its security demands met, one of which is that Ukraine never becomes a NATO member? What other prospects are there for the two sides, or to NATO to calm down and relax, and for Russia to back off?
Well, I think the West, NATO and the U.S. have made clear that sort of red line for Russia is a non-starter in terms of removing the NATO prospects. And Russia has certainly voiced its anger over that, and that's why I think we see the military buildups continue. But I still maintain that there is some middle ground, if you will, because Russia knows that NATO is not going to be removing that off the table, and so it's trying to kind of extract some concessions, whether that is in terms of troop deployments, weapons deployments, things of that nature. So it's not going to be able to get everything that it wants, of course, but there's still some room for maneuver.
There is some speculation that Russia has more to gain from the threat of an invasion than an invasion itself. Is Putin bluffing here?
Well, whether Putin is bluffing or not remains to be seen, but I think there is some credibility to that claim in the sense that right now Russia is tactically positioning itself to be able to move into Ukraine. But strategically, there's a lot of constraints there, whether that's in the economic sphere in terms of major sanctions that the West could pass against Russia, even military implications in terms of accelerating what Russia is trying to avoid, which is Ukraine's further Western integration into the security sphere. So right now, while we're still at the diplomatic stage, that bluff is something that can be useful for Russia, but it can also backfire.
If Russia conducts nuclear weapons exercises as it's threatening to do so, what can and should the US and its NATO allies do? What would those kinds of exercises mean for this crisis?
Well, this is an important point here because Russia has said that it's basically leaving the military option on the table, although it continues to maintain that it won't be invading Ukraine. But a country like Belarus, which is more allied with Russia, that's somewhere where we could see some kind of military response. It wouldn't be an invasion, but it would be perhaps the deployment of further troops and weaponry, including possibly even nuclear weaponry. And I think this is part of the diplomatic negotiations that Russia is trying to drive with the West in order to get them to back down on some of their resistance.